Peace be with you and a very warm welcome. Today we're diving into a really powerful section of the Qur'an from Surah Nisa, verses 71 to 100. These verses offer what is essentially a blueprint for how a community can handle some of life's toughest challenges, everything from outside threats to arguments from within. So let's explore this amazing guidance together.
So, the big question we're going to be wrestling with is this. When things get tough, when there's conflict and division, how does a community actually figure out its moral compass? It's amazing. These verses, revealed over 1,400 years ago, are talking about timeless issues, justice, unity, moral clarity, that are just as important today as they were back then.
All right, so the very first thing that comes up is something really practical. It's this foundation of readiness. Before we even get into the deep ethical stuff, the text says, hold on, first, a community has to be vigilant, it has to be organized, and it has to be prepared for whatever comes its way.
Right out of the gate, the Qur'an sets up this powerful contrast. On one side, you've got the believers. Verse 71 calls on them to take your precaution, to be ready, to be a unified group. But then, immediately in the next verse, we meet this other character, the lingerer. This is the person who hangs back, who's not motivated by duty, but by a desire to avoid any personal risk. It's a really fascinating look at human psychology.
And you see their true colors in the very next verse. When things go well, when there is a victory or a reward, suddenly this same hesitant person is saying, I wish I had been there. But it's only to share in the gain. The text makes it crystal clear. That kind of conditional, self-serving loyalty, it's just toxic for a community's morale and its unity. So, after laying that groundwork of being prepared, the text pivots to a much deeper question. It's not just about how to be ready, but why. What's the moral heart of the cause? What actually makes a struggle just in the first place?
This verse, wow, this is really the ethical anchor for this whole section. It asks this direct, soul-searching question. And notice, the reason given for a struggle isn't about gaining power or land. No, it's framed as a moral duty to stand up for the helpless, the men, the women, and the children who are being oppressed.
Now, to really drive this moral contrast home, the text introduces a really important term, taghut. This is a powerful word. It basically means any form of tyranny, any power or authority that rebels against divine justice and compassion. It's the embodiment of corruption. And this brings us to the very clear line drawn in verse 76. Those who believe, they fight in the cause of God, which, as we just saw, is all about justice for the oppressed. On the other hand, those who disbelieve are fighting for the cause of taghut, for tyranny. And then the verse ends with this incredible reassurance, that the schemes rooted in evil are, in the end, weak. Okay, now we're moving into what might be the most complex and practical part of our explainer, because the text doesn't just stick with high-level moral ideals, it actually lays down specific, on-the-ground rules for how to get through a crisis, from how you manage information to the actual laws of engagement. Get this, how incredibly relevant is this piece of advice from verse 83? In times of fear and uncertainty, the command is simple: don't spread rumors. Instead of causing panic, you should take matters of security and bring them to the leadership, to the people who can actually investigate and figure out the truth. That's a foundational principle for any stable society. The verses also give guidance for dealing with real threats. Verse 89 talks about people who are actively hostile and treacherous, who openly want to see the community fail. And in that very specific context of active hostility and betrayal, it tells believers not to take those groups as allies. But, and you have to hear this because this is a critically important but, that very stern instruction is not the final word. It's not absolute. The text immediately pivots to lay out clear exceptions, showing that the path to peace is always, always the preferred goal. In verse 90 spells it out with total clarity. If an opposing group has a treaty with you, if they back away from the fight, or if they offer you peace, the Qur'an is explicit. You have no cause against them. The door for de-escalation is meant to be kept wide open. And just to hammer home the absolute sanctity of a person's life, verse 93 delivers this unbelievably stark warning about intentional murder. It's presented as one of the most serious sins imaginable, with the gravest of consequences.
So what happens if a killing is accidental? Well, here verse 92 lays out this detailed process that's really a system of restorative justice. It's not just about punishment, it's about healing. It involves an act to free someone, financial compensation to the victim's family, and a path for personal repentance. It's all designed to heal the community and show how valuable every single life is. And finally, in this section on rules, we get this crucial ethical command in verse 94. It says, be careful, investigate. Don't rush to judgment, especially if someone offers you a greeting of peace. The verse warns against making false accusations just because you're hoping for some worldly gain, and it reminds believers, hey, you were vulnerable once too.
This brings us to our final section, and this is where all these ideas about justice and rules get balanced with this deep understanding of divine mercy and personal choice. The text looks at the responsibilities people have and how those responsibilities are shaped by their actual, real-life circumstances. And I love how nuanced this is. On the one hand, verse 97 holds people accountable. If you could have left an oppressive situation but you chose not to act, you'll be questioned. But then, the very next verse makes this beautiful, compassionate exception for the genuinely helpless, the people who are truly trapped with no way out. For them, there is no blame, only hope in God's mercy. So why the number 2? Because this whole passage is beautifully wrapped up by emphasizing 2 of God's most powerful names, forgiving and merciful. Verse 100 promises that if someone leaves their home for God's cause, even if they die on the journey, their reward is already guaranteed. It's this profound message of hope from a Lord who is defined by forgiveness and mercy. So if we pull all these threads together, we see some really clear principles shining through. Justice is for the oppressed. We have to verify information and not jump to conclusions. Peace should always be the priority when it's offered. Our accountability is tied to what we are actually able to do. And woven through all of it is this constant thread of divine mercy, especially for those who are most vulnerable.
And that leaves us with one last question to think about. In our world, which is still so full of conflict and injustice, how can these ancient principles on justice, on careful rules of engagement, and this profound emphasis on mercy, how can they continue to challenge us and guide us as we try to build more just and compassionate societies today? Thank you so much for joining me.